Hello and welcome to the Sales Code Leadership Podcast with your host, Kevin Teeler, and our guest this week, Tom Glason, who is the CEO of ScaleWise and the founder of Pavilion UK. Tom, how are you today?
Yeah, I'm really well, Kevin. Delighted to be here. The sun is shining in my little village in Leicestershire. So yeah, all is well.
You live in a small village, do you?
I do, yeah, very rural. So about an hour north of London from St Pancras in the Midlands. So just near Market Harbour is our nearest town.
How many people do you reckon in that village?
I reckon there's probably near 1,000 now. There's been quite a few kind of developments, these small scale, quite nice developments popping up. But we're probably a 750 to 1,000, I reckon.
I'd call that a town, wouldn't you?
Nah, it's definitely not a town. It's got that village vibe. It's got that village vibe.
That's
Lots
a nice
of horses,
thing.
horses that walk along my street in the morning, and fields on my doorstep. I can get on the bike and be out in the countryside within seconds. So it feels like a village.
Have you heard of the Dunbar number?
Yes, isn't that really low though? That's like 150 or something. Is that right?
Apparently, yeah. I think it was a British psychologist, Robin Dunbar, who worked out that the maximum number of people that you could have any kind of real relationship with was 150, which used to be the size of a small village.
Yes. And it was actually a principle that guided Pavilion when we were starting to think about this concept of small groups or core groups, I think they were called, back end of last year, which were 150 members brought together around Dunbar's theory that, that was the maximum number that you could get to know, remember, build relationships with. But anyway, that's another story.
No, it's a good story though, Tom. It's a good story. I like it because it's one of the reasons why I started this podcast, because we serve the same audience predominantly, don't we? The chief revenue officer or the sales leader or the marketing leader of a growing SaaS company. And I found that most of those people, the one thing they don't have much of is time with their peers. Right. Which I think if I ask you what it is you get paid to do today, you're probably going to tell me something like that, aren't you?
Well, it definitely involves spending lots of time with my peers, which I'm really, really grateful for. But I think what I really get paid for is two things: my knowledge and my network. And the reason why I say, I suppose, those two things is that my company ScaleWise and ultimately Pavilion are both very much in that space, and the space I'm talking about is B2B SaaS and go to market, and that's a world that I've spent the last 20 years in. So I think my knowledge and my network in that area is what really I get paid for.
A wise man who was a previous guest on this podcast, actually, Rashid Ogunlura. He said to me a couple of years ago when I was starting out as a coach, because he's a very experienced coach, he said, when you start in a business like this, your network is your net worth.
Absolutely. And you know what? I was a terrible networker growing up in the early part of my career. And it was actually my wife that said to me, probably in my late 20s, you need to get out more and meet more people, A, like you, but B, that, could be helpful or you could be helpful too. And I don't know why. I just had just a thing about networking that I just didn't like. I just thought the concept of like trying to make small talk with people in some bar in, I don't know, the outskirts of wherever. I was just thinking, that's not what I want to do. And it's quite ironic now that she now calls me the best networked and connected revenue leader in London that doesn't live in London. But it is funny that the journey that I've been on with networking is an interesting one, and obviously now it's such an important part of what I do, and I see immense value in that for sure.
We're talking about a journey. Is this the career that you had in mind when you were 16?
Do you know what? I don't actually think I had a career in mind when I was 16. I think I was too busy chasing after girls and smoking weed and listening to Cypress Hill, listening to a lot of Cypress Hill and gangster rap. It probably wasn't until I got to uni, I think, that I decided that my kind of two big passions at the time were sport and psychology. And actually, I wanted to become a sports psychologist. That was the kind of thing that I decided I was going to do. I went and studied sports psychology in my final year, and my dissertation was on sports psychology. I got a first. I don't quite know how, given the amount of weed and Cypress Hill I listened to whilst growing up, but I got a first. And then I just decided, you know what, this is a long slog. I realized that to become an actual sports psychologist working within professional and elite sport, I had to go on and do a master's, and I probably had to go and do a PhD, and I had to do some kind of very low paid roles, kind of supporting other people in that capacity. And I was like, no, I need to make some money. And I think I was quite committed when I left uni to just going out and making some money. And obviously fell into sales, which actually I think has a lot of transferability from sports psychology. I've always thought that. I've always felt that sales and sports psychology have a few quite key commonalities, which has, I think, helped me over the years as well.
Oh, go on. You have to tell us what those are.
Well, I suppose there's a few things. If you think about sport, you're dealing with failure quite a lot, and maybe rejection. But also, how do you deal with success? Kind of when you win, how do you internalize those feelings? What do you attribute success and failure to? So there's a lot about the mind and how you cope. In fact, that was what my dissertation was on in my final year, was what we call causal attribution. So when you lose, what do you attribute that internally or externally? And the same with when you win. Mental preparation, I think, is definitely a big part of sport and sports psychology, but also sales. Like, how do you prepare to go into that big meeting? And I think linked to that is kind of, how do you control your nervous system and your levels of anxiety when you're faced with competing in a big event or going into a big and important meeting. So I think there's lots that you can take from the world of sports psychology and apply into sales. And it's actually something I would talk a lot to my sales reps and team about, when I was leading them. So I feel like I've kept a strand of what was my passion at 18 in the work that I've done over the last 20 odd years.
We're going to talk more about that in the main topic of this podcast, which will be leading salespeople. But before we get to that point, I'm kind of interested to know: are you still playing a lot of competitive sport yourself?
Not as much as I would like, but I'm now in my mid-40s, Kev. So I think it's hard to compete. But my big sport growing up was squash and racket sport. So I played at a decent level. I've actually now started to pick back up the racket again after probably 10 or 15 years since I had kids of not really playing and just really enjoying it, like really enjoying it. It's such a fun sport, hard work, like really kind of puts you through the ringer. But actually, I really got into triathlons over the last few years. Cycling probably being the thing that I still do the most, swimming the bit that I struggle the most with. But I've always been sporty, but racket sports really has been my thing. So tennis, badminton, squash, table tennis, anything with a ball and a bat, that's been me. I've loved it.
I've always found those games enormously frustrating, maybe because I'm not particularly coordinated, but also because I'm extremely competitive. So I agree with you. The competition side of things, I think, comes out. I've often thought that sports is a competitive game, really, and it's one that I've usually done quite well at. So I'm one of these people. I only like to play games I think I can win.
Well, it's funny you should say that. It's actually why I stopped playing squash, because in my head I could play so much better than I could when I got into kind of my mid-30s. I was still competing like I was like 18, 19 in my head, but actually my body would just be ruined and like for 3 or 4 days afterwards, and I wouldn't be winning quite as much as I thought I should be. And it did get frustrating, but now I've kind of gone back into it with an open mind and just less pressure on trying to compete and just enjoying it. And that's I'm enjoying that now.
So how did you come into sales as a sales leader then? I mean, how long were you a kind of a bag-carrying sales rep before you ascended the heights of management, Tom?
Well, I got into sales straight after uni, and quite fortuitously or kind of accidentally, I suppose. I walked into a local employment agency that was on the campus of the university where my parents were living back in Leicester. So I walked into De Montfort University's recruitment agency. And I said, look, I'm just looking for some temp work, like anything. In my mind, I just wanted to go off and travel for a bit. And I walked in. There was a very attractive looking woman that greeted me at the door, sat me down for kind of a bit of an interview to see what I could be suitable for. And by the end of that said, you know what, you should actually think about joining a recruiter like us. I think you'd be good at sales and we're looking for a new salesperson. Anyway, lo and behold, 2 weeks later, I was in that business. started my journey into sales as a recruiter, and that lovely lady that greeted me at the door is now my wife, Karen. So what ended up happening is Karen and I spent 9 months kind of working on this recruitment desk, me bringing in the clients, chucking them over the fence to her to service, to find students to fill these roles. And after 9 months, we made enough money. Thankfully, we were good at what we did. We made enough money to quit our jobs simultaneously and travel the world for a year. So that was an amazing experience. We came baach still as a couple,
which was no mean achievement, probably.
Yeah, after 9 months of, well, only 9 months of knowing each other, and then a year in each other's pockets, day in, day out. We were offered to set up our own branch of that recruitment consultant up at Chester on Chester University campus. We politely declined, decided that recruitment wasn't for us. I wanted to get into B2B tech. And actually, that was when I moved to Bristol. I got my first sales job for a very early stage startup in the mobile ticketing space, so sending barcodes to mobile phones. But this was back in 2003, so 20 years ago, when really the market wasn't quite ready for that kind of tech. Certainly, the kind of scanning infrastructure wasn't where it needed to be. So I probably spent, like, I don't know, maybe a year or two there. I've got lots of stories about that. That was like the biggest lesson on how not to scale a startup, by the way. And I mean, there was some interesting decisions that were made and things that were done in that 2 years. But I learned a lot about B2B sales at that point.
And was that with Tom? Was that cloud-based software in 2003?
Yeah, it was sending kind of. What we were doing is we were sending what was called MMS messages to mobile phones, which had a barcode, a 2D barcode on them.
Yeah.
And those barcodes could be used to gain access to trains or cinema tickets, and we had some great like early customers, like the Las Vegas monorail was our first real customer.
That's you can imagine, pretty random for a Bristol-based startup.
So, but we were flying out to Las Vegas, of course, first class, of course, because we had £2 million in the bank from some high net worths, but just bunking,
happy days,
bunking a lot of money on the wrong things, feeling like we'd made it, and I had View Cinemas was actually one of the clients that I brought on. We had a couple of kind of train operating companies in the UK doing pilots, but quite frankly, as I said, the scanning infrastructure was too expensive. It wasn't particularly reliable via MMS messages. And now, obviously, you see it all the time. Like people are just whizzing through certainly at St Pancras, whizzing through those gates, with mobile tickets. So we're probably about 10 to 15 years too early with the tech. But we
just 10 or 15 years.
But we were pioneering, man. We felt super cool. Super cool pioneering these tickets and feeling like we'd made it, flying first class out to Las Vegas every few months. But anyway, I did that for a bit. I then actually got approached by one of the partners I'd been able to do a deal with around the train companies, a company called Atos Origin. Atos Origin is a big blue chip IT services company, 100,000 employees, French owned. And I joined them with the purpose of selling large seven-figure kind of managed services and IT outsourcing deals. Did that for 3 years. And I have to say, it was the most miserable 3 years of my life. Not just because I realized that I'm really not cut out for long sales cycles. And by the way, I did reasonably well. I made some good money, but I had the worst flipping boss that you could ever imagine that basically made my life hell. I think the team that she was leading was kind of underperforming. She was under a lot of pressure. She basically cascaded that down. She ended up being just a micromanaging kind of bully, really worked hard to undermine everything you did and just be all over everything. And so, in fact, it was that really inspired me, I think, to be the leader that I became, or certainly it was one of the key things. I mean, I ended up leaving the company with stress and it was massively affecting me in my personal life and my sleep and everything. But I was very fortunate that I jumped straight into a Bristol-based startup called Bright Pearl just after they'd raised their Series A. I actually knew the founder, one of the co-founders, because he used to sit near me at Atos Origin, so he knew kind of what I was about as a salesperson and as a human. And he took a punt on me. He said, "Look, we're looking for a sales leader. We just raised our Series A from Notion. Would you come in as effectively on the exec team as our VP sales?" And there wasn't really much sales team there, kind of two people that weren't really salespeople. But that was my big break into sales leadership. So I'd kind of done a couple of years in early stage startups, learned a ton about how not to scale a startup. Did 3 years in large enterprise sales, really learning the fundamentals of medpic and sales process, and all of the kind of stakeholder management stuff that's important when you're enterprise selling. And then went back into startups and have stayed in that world ever since. And that was obviously my first step into sales leadership, and had a great run at Bright Pearl for 6 years over multiple rounds of funding, ultimately then being acquired by Sage. So yeah, long answer to your short question.
But you became a sales leader when you were like 26 or something, did you?
Yeah, I must have been 26. Yeah, I think you're
Uh-huh.
right. 26, 27. Yeah, around that time. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think you were any good when you started?
Do you know what? I think what I was a real student of the role, and I'd made a real commitment to myself that I wasn't going to be. In fact, I was going to be the polar opposite of the sales leader that I had in my previous role.
Yeah.
And I suppose I was really committed to being the kind of sales leader that could have a positive impact on people's lives, that could be that positive ripple effect that would extend out, not just for work, but into their home lives, their social lives, and ultimately their levels of happiness. Because I knew the reverse impact of that on me in my previous role. And so I think, probably what I started off being was maybe a bit too nice. And I had to try and find a balance between, like, how do you strike that balance between mutual respect, trust, understanding, being very open and giving and supportive, versus having to make tough decisions sometimes and deal with underperformance. But I was very, I think, as I said, I was a student of the game. I read a lot of books and listened to a lot of podcasts, and really just was constantly focused on being better as a leader every day myself. Helped by the fact that Karen, by the way, who obviously was my wife by this point, no, not quite by that point, but she was in leadership development, so that was her world. And so often, we'd spend Friday nights over a bottle of wine, dissecting, the leadership decisions that I had made or should be making, and she'd give me a lot of frameworks and models to be thinking about. So Karen was a real source of inspiration, I think, for me during that time as well.
What's the best book on leadership that you've read in that period of time?
Well, I've read a ton. I mean, if I think just about broadly leadership, I really like David Marquet's Turn the Ship Around. I can speak a lot about that book. I actually had David Marquet come in and talk to Pavilion a couple of years ago. I did a kind of Q&A with him, and he's just such an awesome guy who obviously turned around this ship, this submarine that was the worst performing submarine in the US fleet, and within 12 months turned it around by essentially turning those followers into leaders, and really adopting some key principles for how to lead. But I think, more tactical stuff, turning salespeople into sales champions, I think it's called, a brilliant book around how to adopt a coaching approach. And I think, talking of coaching, just a brilliant book by Sir John Whitmore, called Coaching for Performance, which really is about how do you unlock potential within people through a coaching approach to leadership. So yeah, a lot of what I kind of learned and I suppose adopted through the years was how to be a brilliant coach and how to adopt those types of kind of servant leadership approaches to leadership as well.
One of our previous guests a couple of weeks ago was talking about servant leadership, actually. And it's a really, really popular topic now, and one which would be a totally alien concept, certainly when I started selling. If you'd said to an old school sales manager, perhaps a bit like the woman that you worked for a while, you're going to be a servant leader, they would have just laughed their socks off and thrown you out of the room. Probably, actually, looking at myself, when I started, I was about the same sort of age as you when I started managing sales teams. And I think I was, well, by popular opinion, not the best manager that anyone ever had when I started. I received some very candid feedback, which I tell a story about this on one of our previous podcasts. But it sent me on a lifelong journey of learning about what makes great leaders, actually. So if you had to define what leadership is, what is it for you, Tom?
Well, I think it is that servant leadership stuff. But for me, leadership is about unlocking human potential, and directing that potential in a way that fulfills, the goals or objectives of an organization. And I think unlocking human potential really only comes by focusing on the growth of each individual, the strengths of each individual, and the well-being of each individual in the team. And I think there's some kind of key facets for me that underpin this servant leadership approach. And it's about creating psychological safety. It's about creating environments where people feel they are trusted and can trust you. It's about sharing power, giving autonomy, showing a genuine interest in people and their goals, and not just their goals in work, but I think outside of work as well. And I think there's a lot that you can then unlock from within that potential by putting some of those fundamental kind of building blocks in place, as I see it. So yeah, for me, it's about unlocking human potential, and that kind of servant leadership is a great way of doing that.
You do need to have that potential in the first place, though, don't you? So I'm going to ask you to put your mind back in perhaps the earlier days of your management or leadership career and think about the best person that you ever hired.
Yeah, I know that I can think straight away. Yeah.
I've got one of these in my mind. I actually made the mistake of telling him a couple of years ago, and he insisted that I write it up on his LinkedIn profile, which actually I did. And yeah, absolutely. I had a long think, but I thought, I did say that. Did I really mean it? And I thought, yeah, I did actually really mean it. So tell me what was great about this person that you hired then.
So I'll give you the name. I'll tell you the context. So his name is Stuart Pick. He was my first ever hire at Bright Pearl. I hired him as an AE, and he very quickly was, I suppose the key thing that I would say is it was mindset, it was attitude, right? So with Stu, there was a real desire to learn, to develop, to grow, to receive feedback. But also a real sense of responsibility from himself and accountability from himself around his results and his performance. And what I remember very clearly, actually, and this is probably in his first 3 or 4 months in the role, and we were getting towards the end of a quarter, and it really looked like he wasn't going to hit his goal, and it was definitely going to be one of those challenging quarters. I mean, it was only his second quarter, I think, or maybe I think it was his second quarter. And the couple of other reps that I had were basically given up. It was a tough quarter. I think we hadn't had enough pipeline. Our SDRs weren't performing. It was the usual stuff, like, not enough leads. And the others had just given up. And I remember Stu, just like there was no way he wasn't going to hit his target. And he was working late. He was prospecting. He was supporting the SDR that, wasn't giving him enough pipeline, but he was there, like, showing real leadership traits in terms of encouraging them and motivating them. And ultimately, Stu went on to become my sales manager, then my sales director, then my VP of sales, and actually is still at Bright Pearl now, like 12, 15 years later, and has done an amazing job. And he probably does need to leave because he needs to get out. But he was just brilliant. My first ever hire, still there, like literally filled my boots and some when I left, for sure.
You're going to have to put that on his LinkedIn profile now.
Yeah, I think I will. If he hears this, I will. Yeah, you're right.
He hears it. Of course he will. This is going to go viral, this podcast recording, Tom. What a great story, though. I really enjoyed that. I wonder then, if we turn the lens around, what is it you did specifically to help him? Had you got the concept of psychological safety and trust by that point, do you think?
Well, I think Stu made it really easy for me. So I have to give him credit. I think he showed such ownership over the role and such desire to achieve. And I think when you've got great people, it's about just giving them the support, the resources they need to be successful, and just get out of their way. Like, don't try and control what they're doing. Don't try and tell them what they need to do or the metrics they need to hit. Just remove blockers from them, like give them support where they might need it. And if there's areas that, I'd spotted that Stu could do with a bit of feedback, he'd always be open to it. And in fact, he'd be more often than not coming to me for feedback, proactively. So like for me, it was just getting out of his way for someone like Stu, I think, and then just let him be successful.
But the other people who are not quite
Mm,
of the Stuart mindset or not there yet,
mm.
what do you do for them?
Well, I mean, I can talk about this in quite a lot of depth because, I got into an environment in my last revenue leader role before I founded ScaleWise. I ended up joining a company post Series B, that had had some good success, but it was very clear when I joined that the commercial team was not in a good place. They were really lacking motivation and engagement. In fact, I think they'd lost all faith in their ability to hit the company target. Not helped by the fact that the company targets went up. The individual rep targets went up every quarter by a little bit. So there was this big push to improve productivity per rep and yield and unit economics. And so, like, literally, my predecessor was kind of just etching up the targets every quarter for the reps. And so that made it a really difficult environment, I think, for me to come into, because I sensed that there wasn't a lot of trust, there wasn't a lot of belief, there wasn't a lot of psychological safety because people were getting fired kind of quite readily for not hitting quota. And I basically came in and realized that the only way to solve this problem was to remove all targets, so that salespeople
You did
didn't.
what?
I removed all targets.
You're
Yeah.
kidding.
No,
I've
no.
never heard that. This is a first for the Sales Code Leadership podcast.
And
A
this
sales
is,
leader and a sales team with no targets.
yeah, and this is rather controversial, and I get
You're not
that,
kidding.
and I don't think it's going to work for everyone.
I don't think it is,
But
Tom. But let's hear
but
more.
but 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 I believe we as sales leaders can often use targets as a kind of blunt instrument to drive performance. And it's kind of a top-down way. It's like a stick, I suppose, to say, look, if you don't hit your target, like, we're going to performance manage you against this, and therefore, you've got to be motivated. I actually think we have a duty to our teams, to our individuals in those teams, to recognize what motivates each of those individuals, and to tap into this in terms of driving performance rather than using that kind of blunt instrument of a top-down target. Because, targets, I think, just by their very nature, they are very directive and they are very top-down. And I think the problem with this is that humans, we don't really like having things imposed on us. It kind of takes away our autonomy. And we can all quote the research. There's been tons of it over the years. Even people like Dan Pink have written a book on it. That the positive impact of autonomy in the workplace is massive. Dan Pink talks about, I think, autonomy, mastery, and purpose being the key three things that drive performance, and autonomy being a big one there. But also, like, there is a ton of research around this. I think Birmingham Business School a few years ago, did this big study. I think it was like 30,000 employees, showed that there was a direct correlation between higher levels of autonomy and job satisfaction and well-being. And then we know from Gallup's research, I know you're a big fan of Gallup as well. We know from Gallup's research on employee engagement that the happier our employees are, the better their well-being, the more productive they're going to be. So for me, this for me was the big awakening. It was like, right, we've got to give them more autonomy. That can obviously apply in different ways. That can be, autonomy around making decisions, contributing ideas, responsibilities, like, limited supervision. But for me, I felt like the big thing I needed to give them autonomy over was their target and their performance. Ultimately, the sales yield, which is what I was ultimately looking to drive, but it wasn't being driven in the right way. And so, like, that's a journey to go on. Like, what I realized quite quickly when doing this is that there needed to be certain things that needed to change about how we manage performance, about my sales management layer, and I needed to make some changes in that as well. But I ultimately believed, and still believe now, that if we take the time to really understand what motivates each person, we can unlock performance in ways that targets just can't. But that comes from creating, firstly, a really safe space where sales reps feel comfortable talking about their own personal drivers and what their intrinsic motivators are. So I think to get reps to really open up about their intrinsic motivators and to open up honestly, you've got to have that psychological safety, which is the critical first step. You've got to be able to build trust. You've got to be able to have conversations around their values, their wants, their desires. And that psychological safety, I think, is really, really only going to come if you make it clear to them that you have their best interests in mind, and that you're not going to use top-down targets as a way of kind of like covertly implying that if they don't hit that target, they're going to get fired. And I think we do that a lot when we impose a top-down target. We're kind of implying, or perhaps even telling them that they need to hit that target to keep their job. And I think just a much more considered approach is needed in terms of discussing what's required in their role, but more importantly, what they are looking to achieve in that role and why. So I don't think this is just about saying, oh, look, just, you achieve what you need to achieve. I think there has to still be a conversation about, what the expectations are in the company and why. And I can talk a bit about how I would do that as well, and what I did do in the past. But I think fundamentally the conversation should be about them, and why they're there, what they're trying to achieve, what their core drivers are. And that is going to be different for different people, right? Some people, it might be about being at the top of a leaderboard and being the best in the team. For others, it could be about, earning enough money to go on a certain family holiday. For other people, it could be that they're trying to save up to buy a car, whatever it might be. We have to understand what those drivers are. And then we, as sales leaders or sales managers, have to work with them to build their own plan, their own metrics, their own goals and inputs and outputs and daily schedule based on their specific wants and needs, not ours. And that's my view. But to make that work, I think you've got to go on a journey, and you do have to have some key foundations in place for it to be successful.
Well, you better tell us what those key foundations are. You can't leave us in suspense here, Tom.
Well, I mean, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think like really being able to lay the foundations for transparency and openness, and open conversations. And I would do that, by the way, by when I join a company is having a guide to working with me. So I really, really openly share how I like to work, what I value in team members, what my strengths are, what my weaknesses are, what my personal goals are. So I'll share my personal goals, my values. I'll also share the company goals, the company unit economics, like expected yield from sales reps and why that is important. So I kind of share lots of personal stuff about me, but I also share, like I open the Komodo about the company and what's needed there, and the importance of things like unit economics and sales yield, and like try to get them to really buy into why these things are important. So that's the first thing, is like modeling openness and transparency. And my guide to working with me was a really good place to start with that, because then it opened up the conversation about what was important for them, and kind of modeling that both ways is really important. And then really deeply understanding their why and showing that you really, really care about this. And building that trust through empathy. So, why did they join the company? What goals do they have in their personal life as well as their professional life? Where do they want to be in 1, 3, 5 years time? What's holding them back from achieving those goals right now? Where do they feel like they're competent and happy? What areas do they feel less competent and happy about? What motivates them? What gets them down? How do they like to receive feedback? Yeah, how do they like to be managed? Like how could I be the best manager for them? So these are all really important questions, conversations that I'd be having with reps to really understand, how do they think? What motivates them? But the challenge was, and this is something I found out, is okay, well, when I'm directly line managing individual contributors, that's great because I'm having these conversations with them. But what about my sales management layer, my middle managers, and how well equipped are they to have these conversations with these reps? And that was the big, I think, mistake that I made to start with was they probably weren't equipped well enough. And I don't think they possibly had the kind of tools in their kit bag to be able to have the kind of nuanced conversations that I was hoping that they would have. So actually we had to go on a journey with them, and that was like one of the key pillars of success here. So I had to invest in them to become better coaches, and to remove this kind of top-down leadership style that I think they'd started to adopt, driving around metrics, like telling them what people needed to do. And we did a book club, which was really, really effective. So we had John Whitmore's Coaching for High Performance. We read a couple of chapters each week. We'd get together, me and my management team. We'd explore the concepts. We taught them the GROW model, which is a fundamental part of coaching conversations, and it's talked about a lot in the book. And ultimately, up that journey over probably 3 or 4 weeks, enabled them to get into a place where they could have the kind of coaching conversations that I was looking for them to have with team members. So that was a really important part of it. But then I think, again, a lot on the transparency side, ultimately what we're looking for them to do is to create their own plan for success, their own blueprint for success, not our blueprint, not our plan, their plan, because people are going to take much more responsibility for a plan that they've created. And so, but what we would do is we would share a blueprint for what the most successful reps typically do in terms of activity, conversion rates, what their sales process looks like. But we would explain that they have the freedom to find a way that works best for them based on their strengths. But here's a pretty good guide. Like, this is what the top reps generally do. It's X meetings per week, converting X%, X amount of new pipeline created each month, which normally comes from X number of calls or emails. So we'd have that very open blueprint, but we would let them create their plan. So here's, you can see what success typically looks like, but we're going to work with you now to create the plan that's going to work for you. And then we would work back from their medium, long, and short-term goals, and we'd work with them to create that plan. So they would decide what metrics they need to hit, how long they're going to, how long they're going to work each day, how they're going to hit those metrics. And that's a plan that they've created, which obviously we will input into, and we're going to challenge and support and stress test their thinking around stuff. But then importantly, we're going to ask them, well, how do they want to be held accountable to the goals that they've set themselves? What role do they want us as managers to play in helping them achieve that plan? And what if they don't hit the weekly or daily metrics that they've said they want to hit in their plan? Do they want to have a quick huddle? Do they want a quick Slack message giving them a kick up the arse? Do they want to brainstorm blockers? Like, how can we best serve them to hit their plan? And I think it's that co-creation, that contracting around, how you lead and how they want to be led, that is really where you unlock a lot of value, because then you're just doing what they've told you they want you to do, rather than being that manager, that pigeon that comes in and shits on them and flies away, or the one that jumps into Slack and tells them that they're not making enough calls today. And that for me is not how you lead, and certainly not the environment that I wanted to create within sales teams that I was leading. And of course, things will go off course. They always do. When they're trying to hit their plan, they'll have days where they're not doing what they wanted to do, or weeks that they're not doing it. But for me, it then comes down to diagnosing the issues and getting them to come up with solutions that they feel they own and that they're accountable for. And that's, I think, where the GROW model comes in. And that's where really good questioning comes in around, okay, so, what did you try, and what happened, and what went off rails, and, what would you try differently? And, what have you tried that hasn't worked in the past? And okay, let's think about different options. How do you think X would approach it? Who's someone that you really respect in this space? What would they do with this problem? Like all of that stuff is all about the GROW model and good coaching conversations. And that's ultimately what underpins then, this approach to kind of removing targets and letting people set their own goals. And so, hopefully that gives you a feel for it. And I think just another, probably just final point that I would say is just monthly personal development review sessions. I think we get so caught up in weekly one-to-ones that are focused on tactics and, are you hitting your number? Have you got enough pipeline? Are you forecasting the right number? Like, like for me, actually more important than that, or as important than that, was the monthly personal development review sessions, reviewing their goals, reviewing their plans, looking at course correcting, and hopefully just focusing on like one or two things that we're going to try and get better at in this next month, or this next quarter. Like not a long laundry list of things. Like what's the one thing that, if we can move the needle on that, we're going to see some benefit. You're going to find it easier to hit your goals and your plan. And we can just double down until we've got that thing nailed, and then we can move on to the next. And that just keeps it easy for I think reps and for managers as well, just to focus on a single thing.
I'm glad you mentioned the one thing,
Mm.
because the one thing I'd like to know at the end, as we come to the end of this conversation, is what's the one thing that you wish you knew when you started your career?
Well, I mean, I touched on this earlier, I think, which is play the long game and invest in your network for the long game. I think that, too many people coming into sales, certainly over the last few years, are looking for quick results, quick promotion. I want to be from an SDR to an AE in 12 months. I want to be an AE to a VP of sales in 24 months, or whatever it might be. And I just think there's almost just a course correction that's needed there, which is that like your career is going to span like 40, 50, maybe even 60 years. Like who knows how old people are going to be working to in the next 20 or 30 years. But I just think like investing in your network, which I probably didn't do until maybe a bit later into my career. I'm really seeing your network as your net worth, as you said earlier, and not trying to like fast track everything, but go through and really think about how would people talk about you, like when you're not in the room? What is that silent PR that exists around you? What do you want, the boss that you had 3 jobs ago to say about you? What do you want your colleague that you had in your last role to say about you? When you perhaps, meet with them again in a role in a couple of years' time. I just feel like if you can invest in all of those relationships, don't be a dick, do the right things for people, pay it forward where you can, right? Pay it forward where you can. And all of this stuff will become a force multiplier for your career, which quite frankly is going to be a very long time. And so I just think, yeah, invest in your network, leverage your relationships, like try and really give back where you can, and play the long game.
It's a very simple formula. Tom, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Pleasure, Kevin. Really pleasure. I'm hopefully I didn't ramble too much, because I know I can get on my high horse a little bit about some of these topics and start to get a bit preachy, but it's stuff I'm passionate about, and hopefully you see that.
Well, if you don't care about it, you're not a leader, are you? It's not
Absolutely.
sincere. It's not authentic. What I heard actually was a lot of the sports psychologist and the sports person in you, which I thought was really interesting, the way you approach leading and managing teams. That seems to resonate very much through that theme.
Yeah, I think the concept of coach is massive, and I think people do confuse coaching for training and training and coaching for feedback, and for me, coaching is actually quite different to both of those things. It is about building personal responsibility and accountability, and unlocking the potential from within. And I think there's just so much research and so much that I've seen that really emphasizes the value in developing that coaching approach to leadership, and that's something that I'll stand by for life, I think.